Hi there, editing idiot here. I just want to let you know that there is a slight audio issue in this video. I didn't catch it until I had already finished editing, and it was much too late to attempt to fix it. So there are times where my voice kind of fades out just a little bit. It's not too bad, and mostly I just miss one or two words here and there. But that should be fixed in the next video. Hopefully it's not too annoying. Let's get into the video. Cannabis, weed, marijuana, whatever you call it, the plant is probably one of the most well-known and hotly debated naturally occurring products in the world. Today, the public view on weed is certainly changing, with more and more people realizing that not only does weed have tangible medical purposes, but the drug's danger has also been greatly exaggerated. However, just a few decades ago, cannabis was completely illegal across the entirety of the United States, with many US officials claiming the drug was just as dangerous as abusing narcotics. So, how did we get here? What is the history of cannabis, and how did a plant become one of the most controversial drugs in human history? Let's talk about it. Before we get into the human history of weed, let's talk a little bit about the plant itself. Now, this isn't a science channel, so we're not going to get too deep into the specifics, but weed is really a catch-all term to describe three different species of plant. These species, Cannabis sativa, Cannabis indica, and Cannabis ruderalis, are all members of the Cannabis genus, which is itself a member of the Cannabaceae family. This family also contains other fairly recognizable plants, including humulus, or hops, and celtis, or hackberries. Cannabis itself is a flowering herb that actually produces several useful products for humans. The first, and probably the least controversial, is hemp. Hemp is made from the stem of a cannabis plant. That stem contains extremely durable, but actually really soft fibers. These fibers have been used for millennia to create all sorts of products, including, but not limited to, paper, rope, and clothing. And even into the modern day, things like paint, insulation, biofuel, and even some types of plastics all use hemp. Hemp seeds are also edible, and can be eaten either raw or made into various mediums, including slurries, milk, meal, or oils. Hemp is actually an extremely useful material that is sadly not used as much today as it probably should be, likely because of its link to traditional weed. Or should I say the uses for traditional weed? And speaking of that, the second and much more famous use for cannabis plants is drug use. Specifically the use of dried flowers or buds, resin, similar to a sap, and the oils of the plant. In these cases, these products are high in a compound known as THC. THC, which is scientifically known as tetrahydrocannabinol, is a cannabinoid. Cannabinoids are chemical compounds found in cannabis plants. Some, such as THC, are able to produce psychoactive responses in humans, while others do essentially nothing. There are over 100 known cannabinoids, but really only a few of these are well known and well researched, with the most important being THC, CBD, and CBN. THC and its subcompounds, such as delta-9, are the main psychoactive cannabinoids. Cannabis, or really I should say THC, is the fourth most popular recreational drug in the world, trailing only behind alcohol, caffeine, and tobacco. I'm not going to describe its effects, as I'm pretty sure YouTube will not be happy about that, but it's probably safe to say that most, if not all of you, already know its effects. In America alone, for instance, it's estimated that somewhere around 100 million people have tried weed at some point in their life, and around a quarter of that population admits to having used weed in the past year. So, it's pretty safe to say that use of weed is very widespread across the American population. Lastly, we should at least quickly mention some other cannabinoids that are widely used. Chief among these is CBD, or cannabidiol. And God, I really hate these scientific names. Anyway, CBD is typically shown to have no psychoactive effects by itself, but it is thought that CBD has at least some medical use in controlling things like anxiety, blood pressure, pain, and possibly even addiction. However, it should be noted that CBD has only recently become a highly researched topic, and further high quality and independent research is still needed to verify the possible uses and medical benefits. That was a very brief lesson on cannabis, and I stress the word brief there. This video is not meant to be a scientific look at cannabis, but I thought it important to at least mention some of the products of the plant as well as what they have been used for historically. I will leave some links to other resources that expand on cannabis and its uses down in the description for further reading if you're interested. Now, let's get into the history of the plant. The Cannabis genus likely split from other members of the Cannabaceae family over 20 million years ago. We aren't quite sure where this split occurred, but it was probably somewhere in Central Asia, likely in the Tibetan Plateau, although I should caution that it is extremely difficult to estimate this with a high degree of certainty, as cannabis, and plants as a whole really, don't hold up too well in the fossil record. However, we do know that by the late Pleistocene, around 100,000 years ago, cannabis had become widely distributed over Asia and had started to spread west into the Middle East and the Caucasus. About 12,000 years ago in East Asia, cannabis was becoming domesticated, making it one of the earliest examples of plant domestication in the world, a feat that is actually pretty common in East Asia. A site in Japan from around 8000 BCE still contains the remains of akins, a sort of dried fruit from cannabis plants. Further, we know that several cultures around East Asia, including the Yangshao and the Jomon, used hemp fibers to imprint patterns on their pottery. We have also recovered evidence of clothes, shoes, ropes, and even parchment, all made from various forms of hemp in Eastern Asia. Certainly by 3000 BCE, hemp had completely spread across Asia and was used nearly universally by the cultures and peoples of the time. According to Chinese legend, the medical uses of cannabis originate in about 2000 BCE, when the emperor Shen Nong, literally meaning divine farmer, wrote the Divine Farmer's Materia Medica. I will not try to pronounce the Chinese name for that book, but it's on the screen in front of you. This book is actually really important in early Chinese folklore, as it taught China how to farm, but it also included the medicinal uses of cannabis. So, I guess two of the most important things in history. However, the oldest known compendium of these records date to 221 BCE, not 2000 BCE. It's likely then that the collection of works of Shen Nong were oral tradition, passed down from generation to generation, with each successive generation adding their own knowledge, until in 221 the works were finalized and compiled by the Han Dynasty. At around the same time, over in Egypt, we have the Ebers Papyrus, which is a collection of Egyptian medical writings in which cannabis is mentioned to help inflammation. This was written sometime around 1500 BCE, and actually contains a lot of interesting medical methods. I'll leave a link to them in the description, but on screen are some of my favorites. In the Middle East, the Assyrians were just as familiar. They seemingly used cannabis as an aromatic, calling it gunabu, which has been translated as something along the lines of a way to produce smoke. It's hard to know if the Assyrians used cannabis for its psychoactive properties or just as an aromatic, as we simply don't have the records to indicate. But we do know that it was the Assyrians who introduced cannabis to the Scythians and the Dacians, and they definitely used it for that purpose. Strabo refers to a group known as the Campnobatii, meaning those who walk on or in smoke or clouds. These people were shamans who used cannabis to induce trances. These trances were then used to divine messages from the gods or to find guidance on whatever issues were brought before the shaman in question. But it also seems to have spread further in at least Scythian society, as Herodotus wrote that the Scythians would inhale the smoke from cannabis for both rituals, i.e. the shamans, but also for their own personal use. This is seemingly the first mention of the use of cannabis for recreational purposes. In the Roman Empire, some of the greatest writers of the period, including Pliny the Elder, Dioscorides, and Galen, all wrote about the medical uses of cannabis, with Pliny even dedicating large portions of his famous work, the Naturalis Historia, or Natural History, to the use of hemp and other cannabis products. Both Pliny and Dioscorides mention the anti-inflammatory properties, with Pliny also claiming it could cure gout and relieve arthritis. Claudius Galen took it a bit further. Galen mentioned the same medical benefits, but he also acknowledged the psychoactive effects of cannabis. Galen tells us it was apparently customary in Italy at the time to serve small cakes that contained cannabis for dessert, and that the seeds, quote, create a feeling of warmth, and if consumed in large amounts, affect the head by emitting a warm and toxic vapor. We also know that hemp was used all across the Roman Empire. In fact, it was hemp that was used near exclusively for hunting and fishing nets, with Pliny even ranking types of hemp on how good they were for hunting. Which, by the way, Albandicia and Anatolia apparently had the best, with hemp from Molossia and Sabine territory following shortly afterwards. Further, at the famous site of Pompeii, sandals and other textiles made of hemp have been found. Following the downfall of the Western Roman Empire, information becomes a bit scarce. It's probably likely that some cultivation of cannabis continued in pockets in the Italian countryside, but at the same time, large portions of Italy were abandoned, and the agricultural productivity of the area was lowered by almost 2/3. It wasn't until the High Middle Ages that widespread cultivation would return to Italy. Back in the Middle East, cannabis underwent a second boom, so to speak, in around 1000 AD. It was around this time that it was introduced, or I guess reintroduced, into Iraq and Egypt. This would start the consumption of hashish, a form of weed that would become extremely common in the Middle East, and even to this day is still prominent. Hashish was almost exclusively eaten, as it wouldn't be until the introduction of tobacco centuries later that cannabis would again be widely smoked. Hashish eaters, as users would be called, was actually a bit of a slur and mostly used in a negative context. Ibn Taymiyyah, an Islamic jurist, would prohibit the use of hashish in the 13th century, but hashish would still be widely consumed among the peasant class and would spread throughout the Muslim world to varying levels of acceptance. Hindu traders are thought to have spread cannabis to the Horn of Africa by around the year 1300. Back in Europe, the industrial use of hemp was widespread by around the same time, and really by this point, most, if not all, of the Old World had been introduced to cannabis in some form. Certainly the use of hemp was the most widespread, but cannabis as a medicinal herb was a close second, and we know that cannabis as a recreational drug was also widespread. In the 1500s, Spanish explorers began to transport cannabis into the New World. Oftentimes it was sold to native peoples not only as good fiber, but also for its psychoactive properties, creating a sort of drug economy whereby cannabis would be traded for things like gold and food. Chile would become the center of Spanish production of hemp and cannabis in the New World. In 1600, natives of the Powhatan people were said to be growing the crop by Gabriel Archer, and in 1613 it was said that hemp grown by the same group was, quote, better than that of England. In 1798, troops under Napoleon used hashish to replace their reliance on alcohol, something that was apparently to their liking. This event would lead into the next period of cannabis history, and this was around the time that we begin to see bans on cannabis and cannabis products. The first, or at least one of the first bans on cannabis was done by, and forgive my pronunciation here, Su'adan Shaikh Uni, the Emir of Jonima in Arabia in the 1300s. And of course I already mentioned Ibn Taymiyyah's ban as well. Napoleon would also go on to ban the use of cannabis among his soldiers, which, well, kinda makes sense when you think about it. In Rio de Janeiro, the local colonial council was forced to ban cannabis when their slaves began to use the hemp brought into the area psychoactively. A similar issue was dealt with in the British colonial empire, as many of the indentured workers from India were also familiar with how to use the product as a psychoactive. This practice would go on to spread all across the empire. It was this action that really began a domino effect. This wave of banning cannabis started in the later half of the 1800s. First it was Rio de Janeiro, but Singapore quickly followed, and then Mauritius and several other islands in the Caribbean, and finally South Africa banned cannabis in any form in 1870. In British India, the crown jewel of the British Empire, attempts were made to ban cannabis in 1838, 1871, and 1877, but all these attempts failed, at least in part because of just how widespread cannabis use was. Around the same time, we see several countries in the Islamic world begin to really crack down on cannabis use. The first was likely Egypt in 1879, while Morocco began to strictly regulate cannabis with only a few local tribal groups being allowed to continue to grow the plant. By the turn of the 20th century, a massive wave of bans began all across the world. In the United States, the District of Columbia, which is kind of ironic considering their stance today, was the first to introduce restrictions in 1906. Jamaica outlawed cannabis in 1913, and the UK and New Zealand followed in the 1920s. Canada did the same in 1923, and the US did the same on the national level in 1937. Although, with these early attempts, there is kind of a clear line between hemp and cannabis. Hemp, at least at this point, was simply so important to the national and international markets that most places were forced to encourage its growth, especially with the outbreak of World War II. In World War II, hemp was used to make just about everything, from uniforms to rope to even the tops of Jeeps, with the US government even creating a film called Hemp for Victory that encouraged the growth of hemp. It was really after World War II that true regulation of cannabis began to pick up steam. The World Health Organization withdrew cannabis from their list of medicinal herbs shortly after the end of the war, and between 1952 and 1960, several WHO committees cast doubt on the therapeutic uses of cannabis and began to paint the plant as an addictive and catastrophic drug. This would all result in cannabis and cannabis resin being placed into Schedule 4 in the 1961 Convention on Narcotic Drugs. Schedule 4 was the most restrictive class of drugs. These drugs, which include drugs such as heroin and meth, are said to have particularly dangerous properties, and are essentially seen as useless in the medical sense. For a few decades, cannabis stayed in this category, and governments across the world considered the plant to be just as dangerous as heroin. We start to see some change begin in the 1970s and the 80s. As awareness of horrific diseases such as AIDS and cancer began to spread, cannabis was reported to help those suffering from the diseases cope not only with their disease, but also from the after effects of other treatments like chemotherapy. In 1996, California legalized medical cannabis, and in 2001, Canada became the first country to regulate the use of medical cannabis. In many ways, this was the start of a pullback from the decades of suppression and banning that cannabis had been subject to during the 50s and the 60s. Across the US, and really across the world, cannabis began to be accepted once again, as at least medically useful. At around the same time, a wave of decriminalization occurred. Decriminalization is a bit of a gray zone in law. It essentially removes the penalty for doing something illegal, in this case using cannabis, while still keeping the action technically illegal. So in practice, this means that in those areas, using cannabis is illegal, but you will not be sent to jail or arrested for your use. In some areas, though, you could still be fined, but in others there is no penalty at all. In front of you is a map of areas of the world where cannabis is either illegal, legal, or decriminalized. As you can see, the majority of the Americas allows cannabis in some form, while much of the old world remains committed to banning cannabis. The UN reports that cannabis was the, quote, world's most widely produced, trafficked, and consumed drug in the world in 2010, with somewhere between 128 and 238 million people using cannabis in 2015. In recent years, we have seen the World Health Organization begin to take a new look at cannabis, with them recommending it be removed from Schedule 4 in 2019, which was subsequently approved in 2020. As we've talked about, cannabis and its products have been widely used by humanity for millennia, from farmers in Neolithic China to your best friend. Its medicinal, industrial, and recreational uses are becoming more and more accepted in the modern world, something that seemed nearly impossible just a few decades ago. We can only hope that as we celebrate 420, more and more scientific research will bring the positive uses of cannabis to light, and that our governments will recognize that evidence. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. This is something a little different, but something that was really interesting to make. I think it's important to talk about things like this, as it really puts into perspective how we should think about cannabis, and how our ancestors thought about it as well. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I do want to apologize again for my absence. I've been having some issues with motivation, and it's been hard for me to really put my head down and work, but I've identified some issues that I've been having, and I'll talk a bit more about that in Monday's video. See you all then. If you have any comments or questions on the video, or believe I've made a mistake, please comment down below, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. It really helps the channel. Peace.